The mountain came up fast on the western side of the road, and the road itself had stopped pretending to be anything useful about 2 miles back. She had been walking since before first light, her canvas rucksack riding high and tight against her shoulder blades, her boots leaving clean prints in the frost-silvered mud that the thin October sun had not yet reached. The map in her chest pocket, hand-drawn on a folded sheet of notebook paper, amended and re-amended in different pencils over 2 years of moving, showed a town. Whether that town still existed in any meaningful sense was a question the map could not answer. It existed, barely. A general store with a porch that leaned slightly eastward, as though the whole structure had been listening to the valley for a long time and had gradually inclined toward whatever it heard. A post office the size of a garden shed, flag moving slow in the cold air. A few houses visible through the trees, curtains drawn, smoke from one chimney. A dog that came to the road's edge and watched her pass without barking, which felt more unsettling than barking would have. She did not stop. She had learned that arriving in a small town without a reason for arriving created a specific kind of attention she did not want. So she walked through, kept her eyes forward, counted the buildings, filed away what she saw, and continued up the slope on the far side, where the pavement gave out entirely and became a rutted track, and then became a trail, and then became something that was only a trail if you were already looking for it. She was looking for it. She had found, over 2 years of moving through country like this, that the places ordinary people stopped going were often the places worth going. Not for anything dramatic, just for quiet, just for the particular quality of air in a place that had been left alone long enough to become itself again. The trail climbed through second-growth hardwood, the trees still holding most of their color, rust and amber, and a yellow so saturated it looked almost manufactured, hung there against the gray sky, like something deliberate. The leaves underfoot were thick and wet and muffled every sound she made. She could hear a woodpecker working somewhere above her, methodical and unbothered. She had $30. She had a folding knife, a flashlight, one spare set of batteries wrapped in a sock at the bottom of her pack, and enough food for perhaps 2 more days if she was careful. She had been careful for 2 years. She was 20 years old, and she had been careful for so long that it had become something she wore, like the boots, like the pack, just another thing between her and the cold. She nearly walked past the hatch entirely. It was the shape that stopped her, not the color, which was the color of everything else up here, rust and brown and the gray-green of old moss. The shape, a circle, precise and deliberate, where nothing natural was ever a precise circle. She stopped. She looked down. She stood very still. The woodpecker kept working. A gust moved through the canopy and dropped a slow curtain of leaves around her, gold and rust, and they settled on the thing in the ground the way they settled on everything else up here. Quietly, without ceremony, as though the forest had been covering it for years and had no intention of stopping, she crouched down. Her fingers found the edge before her eyes did. Under the moss, dense, cold, almost sculpted with moisture, was a rim of cast iron, maybe an inch proud of the surrounding stone. She pressed her palm flat against the surface and felt the shape fully, circular, perhaps 2 feet across, the iron stippled with old rust but intact. There was a recessed pull handle on one side, packed solid with compacted dirt and root fiber. She worked at it with her folding knife, scraping carefully, the way she did everything, without wasting motion, without hurrying, because hurrying broke things, and broken things cost time she didn't have. It took longer than she expected. The roots had grown through the handle's gap in at least 3 places, pale and determined, the kind of thin roots that feel fragile and then don't give at all. She cut what she could reach. She dug at the rim with the knife's tip, prying the accumulated decades loose in small, dark clumps. Her knees were wet through. The sky above the canopy was the flat, pale color of old tin. When she finally worked 2 fingers under the handle and pulled, it resisted. She braced her other hand against the stone lip and pulled again, harder, and something gave a sound, not a crack, but a long, low groan, metal against stone, and then it swung upward on a hinge she hadn't known to expect, and the cold air that came out of the gap hit her face like a held breath, finally released. She sat back on her heels. The smell was stone and damp, and something older underneath. Not rot exactly, more like the smell of a place that had been closed against the world for a very long time, and had arrived at a kind of equilibrium with its own sealed air. It wasn't unpleasant. It was the smell of stopped time. She switched on the flashlight. The beam went down 8 feet, maybe a little more, and landed on a stone floor. Not packed earth, stone, fitted, deliberate. The walls were the same, coursed fieldstone, the kind laid by someone who knew what they were doing. A narrow iron ladder was fixed to the near wall, its rungs red with rust but holding their shape. And there, along the far wall, she tilted the beam and held it steady, because she needed to be sure she was seeing what she thought she was seeing. There were shelves. Wooden shelves, built into the stone, and on them, row after careful row, mason jars. She stayed crouched over the open hatch for a long moment, just looking. She went down. The decision didn't feel like a decision. It felt like the next thing her body knew to do, the way you step through a door you've already crossed to in your mind. She tested the first rung with her boot, putting weight on it slowly, letting it speak. It held. The rust was surface rust. The iron itself still had its integrity, still remembered what it was made for. She descended rung by rung, one hand on the ladder, the other holding the flashlight angled out and downward, watching the floor come up to meet her. She stepped off onto fitted stone and stood very still. The ceiling cleared her head by less than a foot. The cistern was 12 feet across, maybe a little more, and the air inside had a quality she couldn't name at first. The outside sounds didn't reach here. No wind, no movement. Not silence exactly, because silence is the absence of sound, and this was something denser than absence. This was insulation. The world had a floor up there, and she was standing beneath it. She turned slowly with the flashlight. The shelves she had seen from above were real, were solid, were built with deliberate care from rough-cut timber, notched into the stone itself. The mason jars were everywhere, 2 full rows across the far wall, some sealed with wax, some with their original metal lids, all of them filmed with dust and time. Whatever was inside most of them had long since collapsed into dust or shadow, but the jars themselves were intact. Then the bed. The narrow iron frame stood against the right-hand wall, its mattress a flattened ruin of rotted wool that had composted almost to nothing over the decades. But the frame was iron, painted black once, and it still stood on 4 legs, still held its shape. Someone had slept here, regularly. The indentation in the mattress remains was still faintly visible, the ghost of a person, pressed into fiber over years. And the desk. She crossed to it slowly. It was rough-hewn from salvaged timber, thick-legged, solid, with a single flat writing surface that had darkened to near black with age and lantern smoke. An oil lantern sat at one corner. She saw 2 more on the far shelves, and one mounted on a bracket above the desk. The bracket was hand-forged. Someone had made that. She set her palm flat on the desk. The wood was cold and dry. She could feel the grain through her palm, feel the slight, irregular surface of hand-cut timber, feel the decades in it like a held note. Above her, the hatch stood open, a pale rectangle of October sky. The light that came through it was the last amber of late afternoon, and it was already beginning to thin. She looked at the 4 walls around her. She looked at the fitted stone, the hand-built shelves, the iron bed, the handmade desk. She had not been anywhere like this before. She had never, Not once in her 20 years been anywhere that felt like this. She stood there until the amber light shifted to gray. Then she climbed out, pulled the hatch down behind her, and listened to the forest reset itself around her. The creak of branches, the distant movement of something small through leaf litter, the ordinary world carrying on above a secret it had kept for 60 years. She made her camp that night 40 feet from the hatch, in a hollow between two oaks where the ground was level enough and the tree canopy had shed most of its leaves, leaving a view of sky. She had no tent. She had her rucksack, a wool blanket she'd traded work for in a town 3 weeks back, and the folding knife. She ate the last of the crackers she'd been rationing and lay on her side with the rucksack tucked beneath her head, and looked at the cold black branches above her and tried to think clearly. October. It was October 1st. She knew mountain cold. She'd come through an Appalachian autumn before, and she carried in her body the knowledge of what a ridge freeze felt like when it arrived. Not the gentle cooling of lowland autumn, but a temperature that dropped hard and stayed, that turned soil to iron and standing water to glass before you were fully ready to believe it had happened. She'd spoken to a man in the valley town who'd said, without her asking, that the first killing frost up on the ridge ran reliable in the last days of October, sometimes earlier. He'd said it the way people say things they've known their whole lives, casually, as though everyone would know. She did not have long. She ran the count carefully, as she always ran things, without sentiment, without hurry, without letting herself skip a step. The cistern would need to be cleared of structural debris before she could trust the floor. The pump would need to be freed of rust before she could know if the spring held. The lanterns would need cleaning and fuel. The walls needed checking for seepage points. The hatch itself would need new sealing to be weather-tight. And she had no tools, no oil, no supplies, no roof of her own, until she descended into that stone room and made it fit for a winter. 30 days. She thought about the desk. She thought about the hand-forged bracket above it, the precision of it, the patience that had gone into a detail no one would ever see but the person who lived there. She thought about the stone walls, fitted without mortar, holding 60 years without collapse. Someone had done all of that work in a season of their own. She turned onto her back and looked at the sky through the branches. She thought, that person started from nothing too. She did not sleep quickly, but she slept, and when she woke in the gray of early morning, with frost already whitening the leaves around her, the first thing she did was rise, cross to the hatch, and kneel beside it. She pressed her palm flat against the iron hatch and felt the cold of it move through her hand and up her wrist. The frost on the surrounding leaves had already begun to melt at its edges where the morning light reached. But the metal held its chill longer than anything else in the forest. It had been holding things for a long time. She needed to go into town. That was the first true problem, clearer now in daylight than it had seemed the night before. She had a folding knife, a flashlight, half a box of crackers, and roughly $4 and some change folded into the inner pocket of her canvas rucksack. You could not restore a room with $4 and crackers. You could not seal a ventilation shaft, or clean a pump, or fill an oil lantern with $4 and crackers. What she had instead of money was time, and what she had instead of tools was the willingness to trade one for the other. She covered the hatch with a careful layer of the disturbed leaves and branches, working to make it look as it had before she found it. Not perfectly, but well enough. Then she shouldered her rucksack, checked the position of the ridge against the tree line, fixed the trail in her memory, and walked. The town sat at the bottom of the slope, in a loose arrangement of buildings that seemed to have drifted there from different decades, and never quite agreed on a center. The general store was the only thing with a sign that could be read from a distance. She pushed through the door and heard a small bell, and a man behind the counter looked up from something he was writing and looked at her in the way that small towns look at strangers. Not hostile, but thorough. She asked if he had work she could do, day labor, hauling, cleaning, whatever he needed. He studied her for a moment. Then he said the porch steps had been needing replacement since spring, and he hadn't gotten around to it, and he didn't have the interest. She said she could do it if he had wood and nails. He looked at her again, the kind of look that was trying to decide something, and then he said he'd give her $2 and a can of kerosene and the use of his hand tools if she finished before dark and didn't leave a mess. She said that was fair. He brought her to the side of the building without another word, showed her the rotted steps, pointed to a stack of lumber under a tarp, and went back inside. She stood in the pale October morning, with a hammer in her hand, and the smell of old wood and cold air around her, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, but direction. The kerosene alone would light at least one lantern, and a lit lantern meant she could stay after dark, and staying after dark meant more hours in the room, and more hours meant everything. She replaced the porch steps in 3 hours. The lumber under the tarp was decent, old but dry, pine boards with good grain and no rot in the centers. She pulled the ruined steps away from the frame, one at a time, checked the stringers with her hands and her eyes, found them sound, and began cutting. She had done carpentry work before, short days here and there on farms and properties, enough to know the difference between rushing and wasting, and she did not rush. She measured twice. She pre-drilled the nail holes so the wood wouldn't split in the cold. She fitted each board flush before she fastened it, pressing it down with her knee, testing the levelness with her palm. The sound of the hammer carried into the quiet October air and came back off the tree line in small echoes, and she worked in that rhythm without pause. When she finished, she swept the debris into a pile, stacked the scrap lumber back under the tarp in a neater arrangement than she had found it, and knocked on the door. He came out, looked at the steps for a long time, tried his weight on each one. He said nothing, which she had already understood meant approval. He went back inside and returned with the $2 and a tin can of kerosene sealed with a cap of folded cloth, and he set them on the newly built riser without ceremony. She thought about the tin box. She had stood in front of it every morning since the first day, bolted beneath the desk, the lock a small brass thing with a keyhole worn smooth. She had pressed a hairpin into it, twice, feeling blindly, not knowing what she was doing well enough to do it. She had measured the box with her hands, roughly 8 inches wide, 5 deep, maybe 3 inches of depth, light enough to hold letters or papers. Not a strong box, not made for valuables in any obvious sense, but locked with the intention of a person who cared what stayed inside. She picked up the kerosene. She picked up the $2. Then she turned toward the far end of town, rather than toward the ridge. The school teacher's house was a pale yellow clapboard, set back from the gravel road, behind a garden gone to dry stalks. She had seen it the first day, noticed the woman on the porch watching her pass with the quiet attention of someone who has spent decades learning to observe. She had not approached it then, because she had nothing to offer. She had $2 now, and more than that, she had a question she had been carrying for 6 days. She walked to the gate. She unlatched it. She told herself that she was only looking for a locksmith or a method. But what she was really looking for, she knew, was someone who remembered. The ridge, the hermit. The woman who had vanished into the mountain and left her whole life behind in a bolted tin box beneath a handmade desk. The woman who answered the gate was smaller than she had appeared from a distance, and older, with white hair pinned close, and eyes the color of creek water in November, pale gray, sharp, and not unkind. She looked at the girl for a long moment before she looked at the canvas rucksack, the dirt under her fingernails, the careful way she was standing. People who have spent their lives in small towns learn to read arrivals the way others read weather. She said, "Come in, then." The porch held 2 chairs and a low table, stacked with manila folders. Not idle stacks. Organized, labeled. The kind of accumulation that belongs to someone who has been doing the same work for a very long time. The girl sat where she was directed. She placed the $2 on the table and said she knew it was not much, but she had some labor to offer, and she was hoping for access to whatever local records the woman kept. She tried to say this plainly, without performance, the way she had learned to say difficult things. The woman looked at the $2. She did not touch them. She said, "What are you looking for?" The girl said, "I am trying to find out what became of a woman who lived on the ridge. Sometime in the early 1930s. People in town called her the Hermit. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of someone deciding how much they already know and how much of it they are willing to give." The woman stood, went inside, came back with a wooden box, no larger than a bread loaf. She set it on the table and lifted the lid. Inside were newspaper clippings, sorted by decade, each bundle held with a length of kitchen twine. She sorted through the 1930s bundle with the efficiency of someone who has sorted it before, and withdrew a single clipping, yellowed and handled at the edges. She laid it flat. It was 4 column inches from a county paper, dated October of 1933. The headline said, "Ridge woman not seen since August. Welfare inquired after." The body of the article was brief. A woman, widowed, who had taken up residence on a parcel of ridgeland following the foreclosure of her farm in the spring of 1931. Neighbors, and the article used that word generously, given the distance, had not seen smoke from her property in several weeks. A welfare inquiry had been made to the county. No response was recorded. The woman tapped the clipping with one finger. She said, "Nobody ever found her. Some people said she walked off the ridge in winter. Some people said she moved west. My mother remembered her, said she was quiet and not unkind, said she wanted to be let alone, and mostly people let her." The girl looked at the clipping for a long time. She did not mention the hatch. She did not mention the desk or the tin box or the handmade bed. But she asked what the woman's name had been. The woman said the name without hesitation, the way you say a name you have carried a long time without knowing you were carrying it. The girl wrote it in the margin of her road map. She had started using the margins for things that mattered: distances, water sources, the name of the man at the feed store who would trade labor for lime. Now this, a woman's name in pencil, beside a mountain she had not known existed 4 weeks ago. She thanked the retired schoolteacher and walked back through the cold afternoon. The light came in low and amber across the ridge, the way October light does when it has already started to say goodbye. She counted the days the way she had been counting them since the first morning. 22 days left. The number had a different weight now that it had a name attached to it. Back at the hatch, she descended and lit one of the working lanterns and sat at the handmade desk with the journal open to the final written pages. She had read them many times. She read them again now, slowly, with the name in her head. And something shifted in the way the sentences fell. They were not the sentences of a woman defeated. They were the sentences of a woman deciding. There was a difference, and she had not fully felt it until now. The last entry was dated September of 1933, 6 weeks before that county clipping. The writing was smaller than usual, pressed harder into the paper as though the pencil needed to be sure. The final sentence ended mid-clause, not mid-thought. She had written, "By spring the western road will be," and then nothing. Not a trailing off, not a smear. Just the clean absence of what came next, as though the sentence had been interrupted not by death or disaster, but by the simple fact of having made up one's mind and no longer needing to write it down. She sat with that for a long time. The cast-iron ventilation pipe ticked in the cold. The spring seam moved quietly behind the stone. The lantern held its flame without wavering. The wick trimmed and clean after her careful work on it. and she thought about what it meant to leave a thing in good order. Not abandoned, not surrendered. Left. There was a difference in that, too. She turned to the deed, which she had laid flat at the back of the desk. 12 acres. The name on it matched the name in her roadmap margin. The registration date was 1931. She had confirmed with the county clerk, carefully, without volunteering anything, that the land had never transferred. The clerk had seemed mildly puzzled by the inquiry, and had said the file was old but intact. Old but intact. She looked around the stone room, at the shelves she had cleared and restacked, at the bed frame she had scrubbed to bare metal, at the walls she had mapped for seepage and marked with chalk. Old but intact. She opened the road map again and looked at the name she had written. She had written it carefully, in small letters, as if the act of writing it too large might make it disappear. She traced it now with one finger without pressing down. She had not said it aloud in years. It was the kind of name that had belonged to a person who no longer quite existed. The girl who had stood in a parking lot at 18 with a plastic bag and a bus ticket to nowhere in particular. Who had learned not to say her name in shelters because names were handles, and handles could be used to move you somewhere you did not want to go. But the county clerk would need it. That was the thing she kept circling. She folded the map along its original creases and set it beside the deed. She was not frightened exactly. She had filled out forms before, had signed her name to temporary employment agreements and day labor sheets and the occasional shelter intake card. Bureaucracy was not the obstacle. The obstacle was exposure, the particular vulnerability of stepping into a county office and making a formal, traceable claim on something she had found in the forest and had not yet been given any right to have. Adverse possession. She had copied the relevant statute by hand from the legal reference section at the county library, sitting at the table nearest the window with the afternoon light coming through, in flat November slants that still felt like October to her. The requirement was open, continuous, and notorious use for the statutory period. Notorious did not mean famous. It meant visible enough that a reasonable person could observe it. She had underlined that phrase twice, and then sat thinking about what visible looked like when the thing you were occupying was 8 feet underground. She would need to establish presence. Not merely the cistern itself, but the land above it. She would need to be seen on it. She would need evidence of use that predated her claim. The work she had already done, the cleared trail, the scrubbed bed frame, the chalk marks on the walls, none of it was sufficient documentation. She needed the school teacher. She had been avoiding this for reasons she could not entirely articulate. The school teacher had been generous with the archive, precise and unsentimental in the way of people who trusted facts more than conversation. But the archive was one thing. What she needed now was a witness, someone who had seen her here, who could speak to the continuity of her presence on the ridge, whose word would carry the kind of weight that a stranger's did not. 3 weeks remained. The ventilation pipe would need sealing before the hard freeze, and the pump collar needed new packing, and she had not yet solved the problem of the lower shelf's water staining. There was a great deal still to do. But first, the schoolteacher. She found the schoolteacher splitting kindling in the yard behind her small white house on the lower road, the axe falling with methodical precision, each piece placed to the side with the deliberate economy of a woman who had been doing this particular task for 50 years. She looked up without surprise, as though she had been expecting the visit, and had simply been waiting for it to arrive on its own schedule. They sat on the porch with cups of weak tea, and the schoolteacher listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of gift. She described the work she had done, the cleared trail, the scrubbed stone, the patched seam along the eastern wall, the hours spent at the county office, the deed. She explained adverse possession as she understood it. Open, continuous, notorious use, the required period, the evidence she would need to assemble. She did not ask directly. She waited. The school teacher set her cup down on the porch rail. "I've been out to the ridge twice in the past fortnight," she said. "I don't suppose you knew that." She had not known. She kept her expression still. "I followed your trail the first time, saw what you'd done with the clearing. The second time I went on my own, just to look at the land." The schoolteacher paused. "I kept a record of both visits, date and time, and what I observed. It's the sort of thing I do." The relief came slowly, the way warmth did when you'd been cold for a long time. Not sudden, not dramatic, just a gradual return of something that had been absent. They agreed on 3 things before the tea was finished. The school teacher would write a signed and dated account of her observations, attesting to the presence and condition of the site and the evidence of ongoing habitation and labor. She would accompany the girl to the county office before the end of the week to submit the preliminary adverse possession declaration, and she would speak, if asked, to the fact that the land had been continuously maintained. In return, she asked for nothing except that the journal be preserved, not surrendered, not locked away, but documented and shared, so that the builder's story would not dissolve entirely into the ridge. It was a fair exchange. It was more than fair. Walking back up through the early afternoon light, the trees thinning above the switchback where the trail steepened, she felt the shift she had been waiting for, the sense that the work had crossed some invisible threshold from provisional to real. The cistern had been a discovery, then a project, then a shelter. Now it was becoming something that could be defended, something with edges, something the world would eventually have to acknowledge. She had 18 days left. 18 days. She counted them the way she had learned to count everything that mattered, not with dread, but with precision. Dread wasted time. Precision spent it. The county office visit happened on a Wednesday, the school teacher driving a rust-edged Buick with careful hands and unhurried speed. The clerk behind the desk was a younger man, mid-30s, who looked at the adverse possession declaration with the particular blankness of someone encountering a form they had rarely been asked to process. He thumbed through a binder. He made a phone call. He asked twice whether the land had ever been sold, and twice the school teacher answered him with the steady patience of a woman who had spent decades explaining things to people who needed time to understand them. The deed was pulled from the microfiche archive after 40 minutes of searching. The original 1931 registration, the builder's name in faded typescript, the acreage described in metes and bounds along the ridge. No subsequent transfer recorded. No escheatment filed. The clerk stamped the declaration with visible reluctance, as though the stamp itself were a kind of concession, and filed it in a folder that went into a wooden tray marked "Pending." It was not a resolution, it was a position. She understood the difference. A position was something you could work from. She drove back up the mountain with the school teacher in the particular silence of 2 people who had done something small but load-bearing together. And she was out of the Buick and back on the trail before the afternoon light had begun to angle. 11 days left when she finished regrouting the stone seam where the spring seeped through the east wall. She had found the dry mortar mix in the back room of the general store, a bag gone stiff with age, but still workable when she broke it apart and mixed it thin. The old man had let her take it in exchange for splitting a cord of wood she found stacked and untouched behind the store. Wood so dry, it split clean and fast, and left her hands blistered in a way that felt earned. The seam held. She watched it for a full day before trusting it. 8 days left when the temperature dropped the first time. Not the killing cold yet, but a premonition of it. The air in the cistern tightening in a way that made her think carefully about heat and insulation, and what the ventilation shaft would do in a sustained freeze. She climbed up and examined the cap, a rusted cast-iron fitting barely visible beneath a tangle of dead root, and she understood that this was the final problem, the last structural vulnerability, the thing that would determine whether everything she had built here could hold through the dark months or collapse from the inside on a night she was too cold to notice. She had 8 days to solve it. She spent 2 of those 8 days on the ventilation problem alone. The cap was original, cast iron, threaded, designed to seal against rain and let air pass through a small baffled opening on the underside. 60 years of rust had fused the baffle partly open, which was why the cistern breathed at all. But in a hard freeze, with ice forming in the shaft itself, that same opening would become a channel for cold air to pour straight down into the room she had spent a month making livable. She needed it to vent but not bleed. She needed it to breathe without killing her. She solved it the way the builder would have solved it, with what was available. She found a scrap of tin sheeting behind the schoolteacher's woodpile, cut it into a disc with her folding knife, and a flat stone used as a backer, and bent a small lip around the edge. Set inside the shaft, just below the cap, the disc would deflect direct airflow downward rather than letting it fall straight through. Not perfect, sufficient. She packed the gap around the shaft's exterior collar with the remaining mortar, smoothed it flush with the surrounding soil, and scattered dead leaves across it until it vanished. Then she spent the remaining days on provisions and the desk. The mason jars she had refilled, traded for, and foraged over the course of October stood ranked on the shelves. Dried beans, cornmeal, salt, dried apple rings threaded on kitchen twine, 2 sealed jars of honey bartered from a beekeeper 2 ridges over in exchange for a full day's work, clearing his collapsed fence line. Enough to carry her through to March if she was careful. She knew how to be careful. On the last evening, with 3 days left before the freeze was due, she lit the oil lantern at the handmade desk. The flame caught on the second attempt, steadied, and filled the stone room with amber light that had not existed here in 60 years. She sat for a long time without moving. The journal lay open on the desk. The photograph of the builder rested against the jar that served as a lampstand. Outside, above the hatch, she could feel the mountains settling into the first genuine cold. She took out her folding knife. She turned the hatch back on its hinge and found what she had found there on her first night. The name cut into the underside of the iron, careful letters pressed by someone with time and intention and something to prove. She placed her knife against the metal and began to cut. 2 names now, 60 years apart. The same answer, found in the same hidden place. She pulled the hatch closed above her and turned back to the light. She was not drifting anymore.